And so our learning target today is simply to understand the CSI, ATS, and TSI plan requirements according to ESSA and how they will be addressed in MICIP. So at the bottom of this slide, you see some of the resources that are available to you. So the very first one is the link to the MICIP website, which has all of the resources on it. And then we've extracted a few more specific ones. So the second link is to the MICIP resources page on that website. And two of the specific resources out of there are the process guide as well as the platform guide. And then we've also provided a link to the professional learning page of the MICIP website. So hopefully most of you have been there already, but if not, we suggest that you might want to go to those resources and support as you're working on your plan. So here we have the MICIP process represented on the left side by the MICIP cycle. And so there are 3 sub-processes to the MICIP cycle: assess needs, plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate. And we'll be talking today about how those processes are used to address plan requirements. In some ways, they look very linear, but as the diagram on the right shows, they are very iterative. And so you're going to be engaging in these, what we sometimes call small learning cycles, back and forth between the various sub-processes of the cycle, and then going over and over again within that larger cycle. And you can see also that the cycle is focused on the whole child in the center, and it's done in the context of the district vision, mission, and beliefs. So on this slide, you just see a bit of a summary of the various categories and some of the attributes and required actions in terms of the 3 different categories of identification. So first of all, if you are identified for CSI, then the district is overall responsible for developing that plan. And certainly, again, anytime we say district with this process, we're including the school, because especially with MICIP, it's very much a collaborative process between the district and the school. It's the schools that are identified, but again, it's the districts that ultimately responsible for making sure that the schools have the plans and what happens within that plan. The state then provides oversight and has to approve the actual plan, and the state also then sets the criteria and the timeline for exit from CSI status. If you are in a district that has been identified, a school has been identified for ATS, then the school is actually responsible for the plan, again, in collaboration with the district. The district has to approve the plan, and then the state, again, sets the criteria as well as the timeline. And you see, again, the timeline here, the designation is every 6 years, whereas for CSI, it's every 3 years. And then if you have been identified for TSI, the school actually plans and does the implementation of the support with the oversight of the district, and then the district sets the criteria. And the designation for TSI is every year. So in terms of the plan requirements in MICIP, on this slide, you see the ESSA requirements, so the federal requirements. And 3 of those are primarily addressed in the context of the assess needs process. So the first one talks about the process having to be informed by the school index growth and proficiency reports in ELA and math. It has to be based on a school level needs assessment. Again, that's in the context of the district, but it's really focused on the school level needs assessment. And it has to identify any potential resource inequities. And what that means is you actually have to go through a resource allocation review process if you are a CSI or an ATS. And we'll be providing some additional training and information, not in this session, but on that whole process. And basically what you need to do is to go through that study process and then post the results of that process, whether or not you find any inequities. And again, as we said, we will be sharing more information about that at another time. And then the 4th requirement is met in the planning process. So you need to include, as part of your plan, evidence-based interventions and strategies. So on this slide, you see basically three different groupings of districts and schools that we're going to be addressing today. So first of all are those partnership districts that have schools that are identified for CSI and they are in partnership status. And if that's the case, then again, you will be supported by the Office of Partnership Districts. And as part of that, then you are required to, as part of your areas of inquiry, so that's where the continuous improvement process begins, you have to explore those areas that are related to the index, as we said. You have to explore the resource allocation review. Those are federal requirements. And then you're also, as part of your areas of inquiry, expected to investigate three areas that the state asks you to investigate. So what is your status in relationship to implementation of MTSS, the district and building leadership and educator capacity, and then the district's classroom instructional, operational, and practices and curriculum assigned to, or aligned to the research-based instructional practices and the state curriculum standards. So that doesn't mean you have to have goals in all of those areas, but those all need to be part of your areas of inquiry. And we'll talk about the goals in the next part of our presentation. If you are part of a partnership districts that your school has been identified for CSI, ATS, or TSI, but you are not what's called partnership status, then you need to explore these two areas of inquiry, just the federal areas. And what these schools are schools that are part of a district who already has schools that are in partnership status, but so that you don't have to respond to multiple areas of the department. Any district that has schools in both partnership status as well as not in partnership status are going to be serviced and supported by the Office of Partnership Districts. So all of them today are just responding to one and being supported by one area of the Michigan Department of Education as opposed to multiples. And then the third area are schools that are identified for CSI, ATS, or TSI, but not in any kind of partnership status. So again, the first two are those that are in a partnership district. The first one, actually, the school is in partnership status. The second, part of a partnership district, but not in partnership status. Then the third one, not in a partnership district and not in partnership status. And if you have more questions about that, you can certainly ask. So again, we begin with the assess needs process when you're looking at new information. And so just the summary of the 7 steps here of the assess needs process. So first of all, we talked about looking in that area of inquiry and what the requirements call for in terms of what you have to investigate. You're collecting data around that and discovering, so what is it that you see around that data? You're participating in that initial initiative inventory that basically said, so what are we already doing in that area? And then moving to gap analysis that says, so how well is that working? And how far are we really from where we need to be? And then we summarize all of that information in our data story summary. That gives us the definition of what we're looking at. Then we conduct our root cause analysis that really helps us ask the question, so why are things the way that they are? Why is the what the way that the what is? And then finally from that we say, okay, so where is our opportunity to grow? What is it that we need to address as part of our planning process? So that just is a quick overview of the assess needs process. And on the previous slide, we indicated how those ESSA requirements, those 3 ESSA requirements are met as part of the assess needs process. So in terms of the area of inquiry, we encourage districts and schools to look at data from a number of different lenses. So at the top here, you can see again the 3 ESSA requirements and how those are met as part of the area of inquiry. So when you're in MICIP, you're asked to categorize your area of inquiry and your data story in one of 3 areas. First of all, it could be academic. could be non-academic, and it could be systems. And you see some questions that we suggest here related to each one of those. Even though your area of inquiry is likely to be in one of those, we also encourage you to look at the others as well to say, so what other data might we bring to bear, might influence, might impact the primary area of inquiry? Up in the upper right-hand corner here, you see some sources of data that are built right into MICIP. The only one that's missing up there, and that's been recently added, is our school data if you're on the west side of the state. But all of those are direct pipelines to data that you can bring into your assess needs process. And certainly you can bring any other data that doesn't fit those main categories. You can import any other data from any other source as well. So when you're taking a look at those three areas, here are some potential data sources for those. And so you see those listed here in the academic area, the non-academic, and the systems area. And also each of those has been kind of subdivided into both qualitative and quantitative data. And obviously you don't have to have data from every single one of those, but if you're looking at building a complete data story, we're encouraging you to at least consider what kinds of data might you bring to bear on your story so that you have as complete a story as possible. And as you enter into that root cause analysis process, you have the data that you need. As you're going into root cause, you can still add data later on, but again, this at least gives you some ideas of some starting points in terms of triangulating those three areas of data. Then also we encourage you within that context of academic, non-academic, and systems, taking a look at these four kinds of data. So whether that's process data, whether that's demographic data, whether that's perception, and certainly all of those in support of outcome or achievement data as well. So that's kind of the second lens that we encourage you to look at. Then the third lens that we really suggest that you take a look at are what we call levels of data. And some of you might have been involved, especially over the last year, in what we call street data. So street data really talks about three different levels. That satellite data, which a lot of which is that highest level, that state level data. So it might be our state assessment, it might be national assessments. We also then encourage you to consider what we call map level data, which is that data such as NWEA or any kind of student reports that really start narrowing it down to look at individual students or at groups of students. And then that street level data that says, and frequently street level data is part of the perception data, but we also often get information about our processes out of the street level data that really talks to the individuals for whom the data is about. So frequently districts will use surveys to gather some of that kind of data, and survey data is certainly good data to have, but we also encourage districts and schools not just to do survey data, but also to actually talk to the people who the data is about and to get their direct perceptions about that in individual or small group conversations. So again, we're talking about the academic, non-academic systems. We're talking about the four types, and we're talking about these three levels of data as data to gather in terms of having a complete data story. The systems data, then, in order to really gather systems data, we need to have some kind of a framework that allows us to know two things. First of all, do we have systems in place? And secondly, so how effective are those systems? And in order to really gather that, as I said, we do need to have some kind of a framework. And this slide indicates just some examples of the frameworks that might be available. On the left side, you see the district improvement framework, and there's a school level framework that aligns to it, put out by the Michigan Department of Education. At the top middle there, you see the whole child framework. The bottom, you see the blueprint. For those who are Cognia accredited, they have a framework and an associated assessment tool. And then lower right-hand corner, MTSS. And we know a lot of districts are using some of the MTSS tools as well. You see some additional ones at the bottom in there. We've also put links to those frameworks as well as some of the tools that they have as diagnostics. So it's not necessarily important that you use a certain framework, but we do suggest that you do have a framework as part of your reference point to know, again, whether or not you have systems in place and to what level of effectiveness those systems are operating. Those of you who have been involved in MICIP know that we have mindsets, and there are 4 mindsets, and equity we talk about as its own mindset, but also as being foundational to the other mindsets. And so we'd like to have you just take a look for a few moments. What we have done is we have pulled out some of the key questions from the equity toolkit that the department has developed around the concept of equity. And we really apply it to all the components of the MICIP process. But what we've done here is we've really tried to pull out some of those equity questions specifically related to the assess needs process and to looking at data. And because of time today, we're not going to spend a lot of time actually having conversation about this, even though that would be the most valuable thing for us to do. But we'd like to have you just to take a few moments and quietly read some of these questions and think about this concept. So how might considering these questions around data define how we approach or impact how we approach the assess needs process? So what difference might it make if we use these equity questions as the lens to look at data or to engage in the assess needs process? So take just a moment or two to read through those questions on your own. So we really encourage you, if you're part of a district, if you are an ISD, to support your districts. If you're part of a school, as you're looking at your data, to engage in the conversations that these questions suggest, and maybe even start the assess needs process with considering these questions and talk about, so if we consider these, how might that really impact the way that we approach our assess needs process? So as you go through the assess needs process, we've talked not only about gathering the different kinds of data, but in this analysis work. So the first one, again, is that initial initiative inventory that asks, so what are we or what have we already done to address the data that's suggested as part of our areas of inquiry. And what we have done as we have tried to really incorporate this process into MICIP is we've actually adjusted some of the questions rather, that we have as part of this initial initiative inventory. And what we've really done is taken this lens of equity seriously, not only because that's what districts and schools are asked to do to meet federal requirements, but also because it's the right thing to do. And in fact, what we've done is we have adjusted the questions in all 3 of these sections for all districts to really bring in some of that equity lens. And so you can see highlighted here in blue, you can see those questions that we have added and or adjusted to this part of the assess needs process to really take a look more closely at equity in the assess needs process. So you can see several that we have adjusted in the initial inventory component, as part of the gap analysis component, and then also as part of our data story summary. So again, just take a moment to take a look at these questions and notice especially those questions that we have highlighted in blue. So as we mentioned before, by the time you go through this first part of the assess needs process of building the data story, you have really defined the what of your data. And now it's really critical that you dig into the why. And in fact, we expect that our plans will be better plans if they're really written to address the why than just the what of the data. So within MICIP, we have several tools that can be used. We suggest that one way to approach this, and again, it's certainly up to the district and the school how they want to use these tools, or if they want to use tools of their own. But we suggest that you might start with the fishbone, which you see on the left side there, in terms of taking a look at all of the possible reasons for the why. And then once you've done that, to narrow it down using the 5 whys, which you see on the right side here. If you don't know where to start in terms of categories, you see a little inset there. It says exploring causal theories. You might start building your fishbone using some of those categories. Just a couple caveats. So you'll notice that teachers and students are listed as possible categories, and these are research-based categories around potential causal theories in education. One of the things that we really want to be careful of is that we two things. Number one, that we don't blame the students, even though students and student characteristics can certainly impact this, that this doesn't become a blame the students and it's all about the students. The same thing is true about teachers. And again, teacher skill, teacher practice, and so on certainly is likely to have an impact as part of this analysis. But at the same time, we want to analyze, if it comes down to teacher practice, why is teacher practice, for example, not where it needs to be, as opposed to just getting into that blame game. The other thing that we really want to avoid is identifying components, identifying elements over which we have no control. Because if we write a plan over things at which we have no control, obviously we're not going to be successful. So just some things to keep in mind as part of that, that root cause analysis process. So that takes us through addressing those first 3 pieces of the ESSA requirements. And then we move from there into the planning process. Once we've decided the why, now what is it that we're going to write our plan around? And so then we identify what our goal is. We set our interim and end targets. There are some requirements around those. Obviously, the main part of that of the ESSA requirement around strategies is done from the strategy bank. We analyze what we have the capacity to do, as well as whether a strategy is the right strategy, using the hexagon tool, choosing the activities, braiding and blending of funding, and then identifying our communication plan. So I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes about that, and then Terry's going to spend the majority of her time talking about the planning process itself. So getting back to this slide, at the beginning, we talked about the areas of inquiry and the assess needs process. What I'd like to do is just have you focus now on what has to go into the plan. So if you are a partnership, if you're a school that's in partnership status, then you must have 3 goals that address your areas of inquiry and address your data. So the goals may be systems goals, they may be academic goals or non-academic goals. They must have 18-month interim and 36-month end targets or benchmarks related somehow to math and reading within the context of those 3 goals. Not all 3 goals have to have those particular targets, but at least one of your goals must have those. And also, as part of your plan, you must address whole child factors in your strategies and or in your activities. So again, just schools in partnership status must have those 3 goals, must have those 18-month interim and 36-month end targets. And by the way, once you write your plan, those cannot be changed for the 36 months. And then again, addressing those whole child factors. If you are either a school that is CSI, ATS, or TSI, in a partnership district, but not in partnership status, or not in a partnership status and not a partnership district, then you may have any number of goals, again, tied to your data. They may be systems goals, academic goals, or non-academic goals. And the key things there that they have to address your data. So just real briefly, one of the things we're encouraging districts to do is, and schools, to take a look at their goals and say, how might they benefit in possibly addressing their area of challenge by using a system level goal. So when we talk about systems goals, we're really talking about two possible things. So first of all, it could be building a system as a goal. And you see some examples here. So for example, you might need to install an entire assessment system if you find out that you don't have a high quality assessment system. The second bullet talks about a curriculum instruction and assessment system in, say, a particular area, or possibly a student support system. You might need to implement an MTSS framework or system. As we get closer towards strategic planning, you might need to implement a facilities management plan or system. And you notice what we've done for each of these also is we have suggested what those might include. Now, that's not saying that every goal that is built as a system goal has to include all those, but we do find by suggesting what those might include is that it helps building out the rest of the plan. So here again are a few examples of that. So if you already have goals in, say, these content areas, might you combine those all into a curriculum and instruction goal, or possibly an MTSS goal? If you have goals in individual areas around student support, again, might you come together and combine those into a student support goal? And of course, almost all of you already have plans in MICIP, and Terry will talk a little bit about that in a moment. But most often you're not starting totally from scratch. You do, though, if you have goals already, you do need to go back and look at your reasons for identification and look at what ESSA calls you to take a look at. But it could end up being that you end up adjusting the goals that you already have as opposed to starting from scratch. On the other hand, again, if you need to build systems to support that, you might end up building a system as a goal as part of your plan. And of course, that calls for a challenge statement. And so we recommend the format of if, then, so that in terms of a challenge statement. And you can see here that the so that part almost always ends up being an impact on students, whether that's students' achievement, whether that's students' non-academic health, and so on. The so that part almost always results in impacting students in some way. And then that leads then to a goal. So what we've done here is taken as an example, just curriculum instruction and assessment system as our goal. You can see what we've done is we've identified what that would be include, why we would even do that. And so in this case, our hope is that students, staff, and parents are going to be able to identify what will be learned, how it will be learned, and how learning will be measured so that they can partner in their students' education, and that eventually our goal is to then reach our identified targets. And what we've done is we've identified interim and end targets to support that, and you'll notice that we used that challenge statement to identify those interim and end targets, and the different components of those targets match up with the components of our challenge statement. And again, so that almost always ends up with impacting students. The second approach to systems goal is to really build the systems to support another goal. So in this case, our goal is around a high quality literacy program. We ask, so what systems must be in place to implement this goal? And again, coming back to, we need to have instructional and curriculum systems, or assessment and data systems, student support systems, and others as well. And so if when we ask ourselves that question, how we respond to that is going to depend on what the data says. And then getting back to the frameworks that we talked about earlier, it's important, again, to have frameworks in place so you can have a tool that allows you to analyze how effective are these different systems. So if you, for example, don't have, in this case, an assessment or a data system in any area, then you might want to build an overall goal of building that assessment or data system across your entire curriculum. However, if you do find that you have, in this case, an assessment and data system in other content areas, but not to support literacy, then there are several ways you could approach it, one of which is to then add a task of building the system to the literacy goal, to support that literacy goal. And so the reason that we choose a task as opposed to maybe a strategy, although you could choose a strategy, is that typically tasks are kinds of things that need to be done in order to support implementation of a strategy. And if you're going to impact a high quality literacy program, certainly you need to have an assessment system in place, but your strategy might be around implement, say, literacy essentials or something more specifically related to literacy, while building the system would be in support of that. So that's why we've chosen the task. And in this case, again, you have to define the task, you set a due date, and you give it an owner. So it aligns with some of the other structures that are part of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry, and she's going to talk more about the planning process.
All right. Thanks, Ben. It is. All right. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Ben? Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to show you now are some slides from the MICIP platform that really shows how you enter this information that Ben has been talking about. So here we start off, this is what we call the goal page. You'll see that you've been reminded about what the district story or the what that children's needs, and then the challenge statement that was created from your determining data and from your root cause analysis. From here, you can define a goal. And again, you want to create a SMART goal here with a due date. Now, we do know that in the plans that you may be creating, you need to think of your windows of 18 months and 36 months for reporting. But the goal itself could be extended beyond that. So you could have a 3 to 5 year goal. And we're going to talk about the interim target measures here. So here we come in and again, give it a short name, something that everyone will be able to recognize. And then you want to add your end target measures and your interim target measures. Now, as I said, if your goal goes beyond the 36 months, then your end target measures are at the end of the goal. So that might be 5 years from now. But the interim target measures are where you really want to make sure that you get your 18 and 36 months. So here is how you enter end target goals. This data choices are from your data story. So if you've gotten to this point in your process of trying to determine needs and then setting a goal, and you realize, oops, we're missing some data here. It is, as Ben had mentioned, this is not a linear process. You can go up to the menu bar under Discover, and you discover data and find your data story and just add that. We do ask, though, that you go back and review all of the information you put into your data story, look at your root cause analysis and your challenge statement, because if that data may have an impact on what you're looking at. So you just want to make sure. But you simply just click on the button and you set the end target measure. So in this case, we want to increase by 12%. You also can do qualitative data. And if you were part of this morning's collaborative series, I saw a very unique way of using qualitative data with quantitative reports. So it's a chance to really it's a narrative rather than having a value of like 12%. So from here, then I want you to look at interim target measures. This is where it becomes really important to set your targets for 18 and 36 months out so that you have the data there. and it will remind you. I've noticed though that a lot of districts are not really paying attention to this due date. And so what happens is it automatically set for the end of the goal. So you really want to be careful with the date picker and make sure that it is the date that you're following. So from here, we're looking at the strategy banks, and really we're going to ask two questions. So this is the first one. What is the right thing to do? It's just to note that Strategy Bank is not part of MICIP. That is an independent application that we integrate into MICIP. So you see here that this is actually the dashboard for the Strategy Bank. This is not what it looks like necessarily in MICIP. So you can go into the Strategy Bank either through its direct link, which is just MiStrategyBank, I believe, .org, and search here, or you could just bring it into MICIP. So when we look at what are the elements of a quality strategy, and there are a lot of strategies in here, look for the ESSA levels. Make sure that if it says not rated, it doesn't have an ESSA level there. At the end of a strategy, it should have resources. It should have the research that's based on that, and it should have a curator. And the curator is important because then you have a source. If you have further questions about the strategy, you can always go back to that curator and ask more questions. So from here, when we determine, can we do, the second question we want to ask is, can we do it in the right way? This is the hexagon tool from the National Implementation Research Network, or commonly known as NERN. And they go in these 6 areas are what research has shown to help or support a successful goal. Can we do it in the right way? So what we ask is that the district would go in and answer these 6 areas. Underneath each of these triangles, there are questions to help prompt you in the discussion of that. Now, with this, there's no right or wrong. If you give yourself a 3 and you have the rest of them are all 1s, meaning that it's low in that area, it doesn't mean you abandon this. You just have to consider, where are you along the spectrum of implementation? You may be in an exploration level, right? And you're just learning about this. We want to get staff caught up on this. But what's most important about the hexagon tool is having those open and honest conversations. And you can see here, every tile has triangles to it. And this is what it may look like at the end. But you'll see here in the very upper corner, it says it's going to be considered in our implementation plan, right? So this is for consideration. It doesn't necessarily have to be there. You can always remove it. And from here, and you'll notice that strategy implementation is our next step. So it's very important that you look at planning for implementation. As I said, if your hexagon tools comes back and it has a very low score, you may look at some of these different stages. And this is an example of the next stage above exploration, which is installation. So just some basic things to consider, in the case of, is the team functioning? Do we have that lateral and horizontal communication, policies and procedures in place, right? Does the staff have the things they need to bring this strategy to life, and so forth? So things to consider. I would have, if you would hit this link. This document is so helpful to help with implementation. So once we have our strategy, then we want to look at what are the activities connected to that. And so this is a particular goal, a plan that has several, and you'll see here that there's a couple of them that are not being considered at this time. That's okay. because what it may be is that we looked as a team, we looked at all of these strategies, and these two we're just not ready to take on right now for whatever reasons. It may be capacity issues, it could be financial issues and so forth. So, but you don't want to lose those in the off chance once you've completed a strategy here, you might want to bring that into your plan. So this is what it looks like. This is the page before you publish in Portfolio. So every strategy has an owner. It has a start and end date. This start and end date is nested between the goal start date and end date. So you may have strategies that are only going to be in the first year of your plan. And so once you get that, then you'd be adding other strategies there. So again, date pickers, pay attention to this. This is the area where these are all the buildings in the district. And in this particular strategy, we're only going to select the one, which is fine. You can select all two, which means every building in the district is going to be doing something in that strategy area. Then you come into building out the activities. And again, I can't emphasize enough, really pay attention to those dates. All activities can be tagged to a particular building. So let's say, for example, everyone is going to be doing something regarding MyMTSS, and your particular building, which has been identified for additional supports, are going to be doing very specific activities. That's great. So what would happen is, even though this may say select all, you can target that activity just for your building. And you can do that by clicking on the pencil. Pencils in MICIP mean edit or add. So, so that's all here. Activities, by the way, are like grains of sand. It can be very fine or be very, very large. I think what's really important is that your activities really lay out those steps and how you're going to achieve that strategy. So this is what it looks like with so adding and editing a strategy and adding an activity here. This does not include our tagging of buildings. All right, moving on, we would suggest that you use an activity planning tool. This is one that we commonly use. Again, figuring out where are you along the spectrum of implementation. And it just helps guide you with some questions, some things that you may want to look at. And then, of course, there's places for you to capture this. Now, you can add documents like this in as evidence when we look at monitoring. Or you can have this as in a Google Drive for the districts to grab it and use it. So you know, when we're looking at entering into that implementation section, we want to know, first of all, do we know what is working, right? We need to bring that in. Do we know what may or may not be getting done with the intended impact? Do we know why we are getting the results we're getting, and how do we know? These are the types of things you really want to look at when you go in and looking at the monitoring process. So here's really our what we call the ribbons of those stages. So again, these are questions just to help prompt you as you go through this continuous improvement process of looking at all the stakeholders aware of their roles when implementing a plan. Now that can be done in various ways. In MICIP, when a district MICIP administrator goes in and adds users to the account, they can add users that just have access to view the plan only. They can't change it, they can't see the data behind it, but they can see things like the goal, they can see the strategy and the activities, the costs associated with that, and communication. So that can be very helpful, especially if you want to keep your teachers informed that may or may not be in the continuous improvement team. From here, we want to look at capacity. We always start with that when monitoring. That idea of, do we have everything in place so that we can implement this in the way that it was designed? Which leads us to fidelity. So are we making the progress that we're hoping to make? Go back to that plan and really look at the strategies, the goals, the activities that are attached. Is things happening the way we intended to happen? And then lastly, looking at implementation, we also want to look at scale and reach. And that is, are we reaching the intended population that is here? And are we keeping in the idea of that scale of, are we still in exploration? Have we moved into implementation? You know, that whole idea of progress. So those three, capacity, fidelity, scale, and reach, really help us with monitoring implementation of a goal from here, or excuse me, of a strategy. When looking at monitoring impact, the impact really has to do with that interim and end target measures. Are we making gain? As we call it, is the needle moving in the right direction? And so you want to make sure you also monitor impact as well. And so that's where the data that you have selected to mark your interim and end target measures becomes really important. So you want to make sure that you have that right data to help you determine impact. And then, of course, evidence. Evidence is very, very important. So if we go into, let's say, we have a strategy where the activity is all teachers will be trained in a new SEL program in the district. You may want to put down in evidence as you go in and discuss that, the idea of, well, yes, we did. Here's the agenda and here's our sign-in sheet. Simple evidence can be uploaded. It doesn't have to be a data report. It can be just something that supports the statement that you're adding. And then lastly, you do look at adjustments, because based on you looking at the impact of implementation and monitoring your impact for interim and end target measures, it may become necessary for you to adjust a strategy or adjust an activity. For certain schools, goals cannot be adjusted. So you'll see in MICIP that we really help with that idea of adjusting. This slide here is really to show you the connection between monitor and evaluate. And really, we're looking at the same elements of implementation and of impact. But you'll notice that when we talk about monitoring, we talk about that in the current tense. It's what is happening now. Where when we do get to the end of our due date in our goal and we begin to evaluate, then it's a more retrospective look of what we've done in the past. So this slide is really to help you to understand the dynamics between the building teams and maybe the district-wide continuous improvement teams. So we know that schools are really where strategies and activities come to life, right? And so the school team would then be getting the data from the implementation of the strategies and activities, and then reporting it to the district. And then the district takes all of that data and begins to look at it in a broader view. And of course, we want to see that there is that collaborativeness between both school and district in analyzing the data. So, and you'll notice here at the bottom, this is really important. And that is, how will you ensure that the monitoring process is consistent across entities monitoring the same thing? And in other words, getting everyone on the same page, looking at this at the same goals. That is very, very important. And as we remind you all, evidence is crucial, because it's not enough to say, well, yes, trust us. We're doing what we're supposed to. The federal government doesn't work that way, right? They say, well, show us the evidence. So that is here. Here is an example of what it looks like in the platform. We are now looking at the implementation areas for a strategy. And you can see here that these are notes that stack on themselves. So it's really important that every time you meet, you come here, you click on create a note, and just give a summary of what the discussion was regarding either fidelity, scale and reach, or capacity. Now, it's not important that you talk about all three areas every time you meet. But over the course of time, you want to make sure that all three areas have been discussed. And then it's very simple to add data now or evidence to your notes. And these are the current integration with MICIP. We are working hard to get MiFi data coming into MICIP. And of course, we're always eager to get the data hub there. So those are up and coming integration data sources that you'll see. And we talked a little bit about the adjustment. So the adjustment, this is what it looks like on the website. It is found at the bottom of your monitoring goal page. And here these 4 buttons just take you right back to the area that in this particular goal to help you look at adjustments. And it's okay to talk about adjustments ahead of time. In fact, I would really suggest that you not like, okay, we got to adjust, but have some have some discussion around that. And with that discussion, you want to create a note so that in case of transition of leadership, or you just have a place where somebody could come in and really read the history of the work of this group. It's very helpful. Here on the right are questions for consideration when you are thinking of adjusting your plans. Here's just 10 questions that you might want to consider about a continuous improvement plan. And these are really very powerful, especially if you're coming in and you're inheriting a plan as a leader. Like, how do I know my plan is working? And like I always go to question 4, do the challenge statement and the goal address the root cause? I mean, is there a connection? So these are just 10 questions just to ask, and we've hyperlinked them so that you have that as a possible handout. Here is how to create reports. So in MICIP, in the navigation area, you'll see here that there's a report button. If you click on it, this will come up. Now, if you're a school for identified for additional supports, these are the buttons you actually want to push. So you want to come in and say, okay, this is the goal or goals we are working on. If it's for a single district building, you want to click on your building. And then here, you basically want to click everything else. This is very important, and it's going to come out in the next release notes, but we've discovered a little bug in MICIP, and that is if you put your cursor by this side or any place that should have a down arrow, it's invisible. So if you click on this, you won't see all of these sub items. So make sure you click on the side here. You'll know that it's right because it changes from a cursor to a finger. So just a quirky thing we learned just in the past week. On the right here is a sample of what should be in the plan. This is the cover sheet. This is all the elements that are there. So it tells me what building it's here and all the components that are in it. And it's very important that you, under monitoring, that you click the interim target measures, and under evaluation, click the end target measures. You don't need notes. You just need to make sure that we see how that's going to be measured. Here is, I know we're right up against time, but here is our staff that is willing and able to help you in whatever situation you're in. Ben and I have been, we're pretty interchangeable at this point, but please feel free to call us. Rennie is our user management lead. So if you're having problems logging in, or you don't, you seem to have, you want to change status, you were a district user and now, your superintendent wants to make you a district administrator, you call Rennie. Rennie will help you with all of that. And then Stephen Curry is our guru when it comes to financial information regarding districts. And so really, Ben, that is my part of today's presentation. And I'm going to stop sharing and give it back to you, sir.
Thank you, Terry. At the end of this PowerPoint, you have some slides which we have used on a number of occasions, and some of you may have seen them. that really just kind of summarize the requirements for ESA, not the state requirements, but the federal requirements, and just has a little narrative about basically what we've explained to you about how these are going to be addressed as part of the MICIP process and platform. So in case those are helpful to you, you certainly can use those. I did put in the chat that a question that I'm sure many of you have, that MDE is currently in the process of finalizing the process as well as the due date for schools identified for CSI to make their plans available to MDE for approval. So as soon as that process is complete, we will get that information out to all of you, probably by way of a Thursday communication, probably also through your PAL if you are in a partnership district, or your CSPC if you are in a non-partnership district. They will have that information as well. So just wanted to let you know that that's coming, because I know a lot of schools and districts as well as ISDs have asked for that information. So with that, that's the end of our presentation. Like I say, we will be posting this as soon as we have a chance